here's another thing you were talking about. Like, who do you like? What is it? What is the cool military leader? What do we think of? Here's one. Would you say I want to promote this guy who has a lot of self-doubt? Right? We're not promoting that guy. But what's interesting is I am so filled with self-doubt that when I come up with a plan and Dave Burke sends a report back from the front line, is like, hey, Jocko, we got heavy resistance. I'm like, okay, I must have been wrong.
I'm missing something. Yeah.
I'm missing something. Does this mean I'm not going to freaking push forward? No, it doesn't mean that, but it means I'm actually doing the opposite of this trying to balance out the dissonance. I'm paying more attention because I think I might be wrong.
The irony in that truth, the irony is how you've described you having a reputation of being so decisive in your time in the teams was based on that belief that you could be wrong, which is why you've made these incremental decisions and didn't overcommit to the end. Was actually driven by what you just described as, the term self-doubt doesn't have like this positive, connotation, but it's like, oh, hey, I bet you there's a bunch of things I don't know. So you know what I shouldn't do? Overcommit. Which was based on you having a reputation of being decisive, which people can equate to the opposite of self-doubt. I'm so secure in my decision-making process that I know the outcome, and this is the course that we're going on. It's exactly the opposite of what you're doing, which is the incremental piece and go, hey, got some feedback? Yeah, boss, here's some feedback. This blew up in our face. We ran into a brick wall. 3 vehicles are down, and we can't keep going. And you're going to go, oh, we need to do something different right now, as opposed to, hey, just keep going. We're sticking to the plan.
Yeah. And that's true not only on the battlefield, but it's also true in a conversation with another human being. It's also true when I say, hey, Dave, what's your plan with this client? Or here's how I think we should approach this client. I'm not saying this is how we should approach the client. I'm like, hey, I got an idea of what we could do with this client. What do you think? It's having a freaking open mind is what it is. And the minute, I said that a while ago, like people's minds, they're either opening or closing. And we can have some control over that. You can control whether you leave your mind open or whether you let your mind close. Well, at least I think. Well, let me rephrase that. I think people have the ability to control whether they open their mind, but they don't have as much control over, if you're not conscious about it, your mind just closes up. And oftentimes our cognitive bias is to just close that mind. I don't want to hear what Dave has to say. So I think what we have to do is you have to form a habit of trying to keep your mind open, prying it open. And I had to, this is going back to the muster, I went back to that old conversation. How often do I have to admit that I'm wrong?
Yeah.
And, I asked the entire crowd at the muster, how often do you think I have to admit that I'm wrong? And everyone thinks I'm humble and they go, all the time. Yeah, probably 10 times a day you admit that I'm wrong. And I'm like, no, almost never. I almost never admit that I'm wrong. Why do I almost never admit that I'm wrong? Because I never go into a conversation telling everyone that I'm right or even thinking that I'm right.
Yeah.
So therefore, I don't go in the conversation saying, Dave, we need to do this with the client. And then Dave goes, well, actually, I talked to the client. Here's what's going on. Here's what they actually need. And I have to go, damn it, I was wrong. No, instead I say, hey, Dave, here's what I'm thinking. What do you think?
Yeah.
That's one example of 100 conversations that I have where I could go in there and try and be right. But instead, I go in there with an open mind instead of a closed mind.
It's so counterintuitive to think the connection between never being wrong or rarely having to admit that you're wrong isn't because you're right all the time. It's because you never entrench yourself in a position. And the saying could be said for why you and I, whatever the better word is for argue, for disagree. Like how often you and Jocko disagree on a plan? It's like, well, almost never. Like, oh, you must be perfectly aligned on everything. No, I haven't predetermined the next 37 steps that we're going to do. Neither is he. And we'll move, and I'll do it his way sometimes. We'll do it my way. We'll get somebody else's input. And none of us are committed to an outcome. And the reason why we don't disagree on what we should do is that neither one of us come in with the conclusion of what we should do. And how counterintuitive that is the idea that the more committed you are, the less you'll admit that you're wrong. Mm-hmm. And the exact opposite is true. Is the reason I don't have to admit that I'm wrong very often is because I don't walk in thinking that I'm right.
Yeah, and actually you and I are very committed to an outcome. We're committed to having the best possible outcome we can have with nothing to do with which outcome or which course, how we get there.
Exactly.
It's like, oh, this is the best possible outcome. Dave came up with a way to make this the best possible outcome. That sounds awesome. I'm in.
We'll do that
all day long.
Yeah.